Hi everybody, welcome back to our class for PCS 101, and this is for class for Thursday the 7th, though I am recording this on Wednesday the 6th, and it's approximately 8:45 p.m., and as you know, this was a very sad day indeed for the United States of America and for democracy. And all I can say is that I hope that when I post this video and when you watch this video, that our country and our populace is in a much better place than it has been today. I can't tell you how saddened I am by the events that have occurred, but I know that the United States is a very strong and resilient country. It's a country that has many problems, but that also has afforded us with many opportunities, including sharing this moment together now. So I encourage you to embrace the positives of the United States and to work with dignity and honor and integrity and within the law when you disagree with the United States. So, as I move forward to talking about the last three major chapters before you are going to be delivering your speech number one, which would be on Monday. And I had indicated that you could either deliver that speech via Zoom, or if you so wanted to, you could upload your speech. Thus far, I've only heard from one of you indicating that you wanted to deliver your speech via Zoom. So if you think you do want to present via Zoom, please contact me as soon as possible so that we can try to find a common time. And also, I had asked that all of you try to contact me via email about a time and a method that would be acceptable for you and workable for you so that I could touch base with you so we could have some sort of an informal practice session. What I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit more about some of the elements that you should be considering with putting together a speech and giving you some three sample student speeches. Students in no way connected with GCC, so you wouldn't need to worry that one day you might end up being a sample speech for one of my classes. And just asking you for today's attendance question to give a strength and weakness of each of the student speeches that I've asked you to view. And hopefully when you read the student comments from your classmates, you'll be able to get a good sense of some of the ways that audience members might respond to a speech. And hopefully that will help you in terms of pulling together your presentation for speech number one, which is the autobiographical speech, a 5-minute speech in which you get to tell the audience a little bit about yourself. And I was suggesting that if you feel a bit shy and you don't necessarily want to disclose much about your life, you can always talk about how education has played a role in your life or is playing a role in your life. But I know that many times individuals prefer to do a kind of life overview where they talk about highlights, or they might decide to talk about a particular time period or element within their life, and all of that is fine. The idea is that you are able to put into effect some of the suggestions that we've discussed in terms of a speech, and also for you to get a sense of who your classmates happen to be in our course. So the chapter on delivering speeches is going to be particularly important because, as you know, outside of putting together the arguments for a speech, you need to present your speech in real time. And the speech that we are preparing for is the extemporaneous speech. In other words, a speech that's prepared in advance and is delivered with a speaking outline, so that you've put some thought into it, but you also are not reading your speech, nor is your speech memorized, because those sorts of speeches usually end up sounding very stiff and stilted. Now, that said, there is such a thing as a manuscript speech where you can read from a manuscript or a teleprompter. And in fact, there are some situations where it's assumed you would do something like that. Let's say a television broadcast where it's imperative that you be precise with your language or with your timing. Or perhaps you're presenting an academic paper and the expectation is that you read the information to your audience. But that is not the kind of speech that we would be giving in our particular class. There also is the impromptu speech, which you deliver spur of the moment with no advanced preparation. I always encourage individuals to try to avoid delivering that kind of speech if at all possible, just because it is very uncertain as to how that speech might turn out because you haven't had an opportunity to prepare for it. That said, you might be in a situation where you're asked to deliver an impromptu speech. Perhaps you've been presented with an award, let's say, that you weren't expecting. And my suggestion is just to keep it very short and keep it very simple so that you aren't likely to make any errors. There also is the memorized speech, and usually that works very well for a brief informal affair, something like, let's say, a toast at a wedding. In terms of that manuscript speech that I was talking about earlier, I've never had the opportunity to work with the manuscript, but even if you, or I've never had the opportunity to work with the teleprompter, I'm sorry, for a manuscript speech. But even if you do have a teleprompter, there are still challenges associated with it. And first, you need to be very skilled because you don't want to look like and sound like you are reading. But secondly, there could be mechanical issues. And if you look at the notes below under the section delivering speeches, I'm asking you to watch a teleprompter fail video where Michael Bay, who you might happen to know, very famous in Hollywood, Hollywood director, was scheduled to give a presentation, and you'll see in the video, it's approximately 2 or 3 minutes long, that his teleprompter failed and he panicked as a result of that. Basically, he ran off stage, even though he was very well familiar with his subject matter, which goes to show that you can be very skilled and very practiced and still not necessarily feel comfortable when you are in a situation where you're not expecting to deliver a speech, because he was very much expecting just to read off of the teleprompter and he was unable to do so. So I always use that as an example that even in what you might think of as an ideal world where you would have the option of using a teleprompter, that wouldn't necessarily be foolproof. So your voice, think about the fact that you should try to vary as much as possible. Things like volume, speed, inflections. You want to try to be conversational, as some of you indicated in the attendance question that I had posted about ways to reduce nerves. And many of you talking about this sense of trying to have a conversation with the audience rather than feeling all of this pressure to present something perfectly, because that's really an impossibility. You also want to make sure that you are enunciating, in other words, that you are forming your words correctly, which is different than pronunciation, because you can pronounce words differently. Sometimes that happens regionally, for instance, the old song tomato or tomato, or if you've got perhaps some dispute about whether it's Caribbean or Caribbean, whether it's harassment or harassment. But generally speaking, as long as your audience can understand what word that it is that you're saying, you don't need to worry too much about pronunciation, especially if English is not your first language. Obviously, you are not going to be able to pronunciate everything accurately and correctly. And then if you are very concerned about it, you could even tell your audience at the very beginning that if they have difficulty understanding you because of an accent or because of pronunciation, to please let you know, and you'd be very happy to slow down or to repeat. That puts the burden of evidence on the audience itself, or the burden of responsibility on the audience itself to pay particular attention to what you're saying. And pausing is very useful. I happen to believe that that's one of my greatest challenges, is that I speak very quickly. So sometimes just slowing down, both for yourself and your audience, can be very effective. It's also a place to breathe. As many of you indicated, one of the best ways to reduce nerves is to breathe. Many of you also indicated about feeling comfortable, being well prepared, and just thinking positively, because this sense of thinking negatively can only snowball. So it's a good investment for you to think about all the good things that can happen rather than begin to worry about the possibilities of all the negative things that could happen when you are delivering a speech. So there is something called proxemics, and it sounds like the word proximity. It's the use of space. This is also important in how an audience receives a message and how you deliver your message, how close or how far away you are from your audience, or what your environment is. Again, this is a little bit artificial because we are working through screens rather than delivering in person. But this is science in and of itself, trying to determine what the furniture arrangement in a room should be in order for it to be most conducive, let's say, for a group conversation or for the delivery of a speech. And things like affect display, which is basically facial expressions, are very important because this is how your audience is going to be able to gauge what it is that you're saying. And chances are, regardless of the content of what you're saying, it's probably the visuals that they are most likely going to use in order to make determinations about what it is that you're saying. And this actually was highlighted best in a very famous presidential campaign, the Nixon-Kennedy debate. And this debate happened in the early days of television. So approximately half of the audience actually listened to that debate on the radio. And what was interesting is that the half of the audience who listened to the debate on the radio after they were interviewed by pollsters indicated that they thought Richard Nixon won that debate because of his arguments. However, the other half of the audience who had watched that debate on television came up with the exact opposite conclusion with pollsters and said that they believed that Kennedy won that debate because his appearance appeared to be presidential, whatever that means. He was well groomed and well dressed and handsome. And in terms of Richard Nixon, he made a huge error by not accepting makeup. Again, these were the early days of television. If you know anything at all about television, you need to wear makeup or else you just look terrible under those lights. And Kennedy did take makeup. And for better or for worse, Nixon was known as a sweater, and I'm not talking about an article of clothing, but then when the room was warmer, he would visibly sweat. And that made him appear to be untrustworthy. And actually, there was a fairly recent presidential debate. I think this was Gore and Bush, if I remember correctly, where their handlers were disputing the temperature of the debate hall they were going to be in because Gore was also known as a sweater. So the other side, the opponents, wanted the room to be as warm as possible so that he would sweat. And of course, his side wanted the room to be as cool as possible so that he wouldn't visibly sweat on camera. And the dispute was only about a few degrees of temperature, but that debate almost didn't happen. And it was purely because of the temperature of the room. So, regardless of what we think should be, the reality is that we most often judge messages by people's appearance. In fact, oftentimes what has been found, if you're trying to determine if somebody's lying, what they do is that they pay careful attention to your face. So very skilled liars are well aware of that. So what some studies have suggested is that rather than paying attention to the face, if you're trying to determine if someone is lying, you pay attention to the body, things like hand movements and foot movements, because it would be much more difficult for a liar to control all of their body, and they're probably putting most of their energy to their face. However, that is an inexact science, or else we would be able to know definitively when someone is lying or not. But a very interesting study was done about affect display from a psychological perspective, examining individuals who are having great difficulty with social relationships. And while you may think that's you, trust me, it's not. These are individuals who can't function in what we would consider to be normal society in terms of going to school and having jobs and so forth and so on. And they were shown pictures of facial expressions, which usually facial expressions are pretty much universal. They're not culturally based. So a smile usually denotes something like happiness, while a frown denotes something like sadness, unless you're trying to be ironic or sarcastic or something. And what they found with these individuals who had great difficulty with social relationships is they were misidentifying these facial expressions. They identified a smile as unhappiness, and they identified a frown as happiness, which could help to explain why they were having such difficulty interacting in society if they were completely misreading our nonverbal cues. Gestures are also important in terms of being able to evaluate someone's message. Lots of different kinds of gestures. Some are conventional, in other words, that they have been assigned meaning by convention or by custom. So, for instance, a thumbs up to say that something is good, for instance. Or a gesture could be descriptive, as trying to show the size and the shape, so to speak. That would be much more universal. And a gesture can also indicate a feeling. So, for instance, slamming a fist onto the table in order to emphasize a point. And for those gestures that have meaning by custom, you need to be very careful and particular, because while it might mean something for one group, it could have a very different meaning for another group. And in fact, the military spends a lot of time talking about gesturing and customs with their soldiers, because what they don't want is for their soldiers to go into a different culture and to use a gesture in a way that could be considered offensive by the populace. So a gesture that would be completely innocent in this culture, but that would have a very different kind of meaning in another culture. And eye contact, and at least in Western cultures, and that includes us in the United States, we assume that eye contact is illustrative of engagement and interest. That's not necessarily the case across all cultures. There are some cultures that are encouraged to avoid eye contact to show respect. This happens sometimes in Asian cultures and Latino cultures. That said, at least in the United States, the assumption is that eye contact means that there's engagement. So you want to have eye contact when you're working with a group, and make eye contact with the camera when you're in a situation where you have to film. And culture, since I've mentioned culture several times, I guess the broadest definition that I can come up with in terms of culture is that it's a group membership. And I guess we can debate whether or not two people make up a group, but definitely three or more would be a group. And basically what happens with group membership is there is a predictive element to the group, that you can predict things such as behaviors, which happen to be actions. And these are things that you can usually observe. Attitudes, which happen to be feelings, and those are some things that can change over time. Beliefs, in other words, thinking something is true or false, those are usually a bit more fixed. And then finally, values. And values basically include all of the above, the behaviors, the attitudes, and the beliefs. They are usually highly resistant to change. That's something for us to keep in mind when we are delivering our persuasive speech. And as I've always said with the persuasive speech, the goal is not for everyone to agree with you. The goal is to earn everyone's respect, because it is an impossibility for everyone to agree. And I think today was a good illustration of that in Washington. But the idea of treating each other respectfully is what we are aiming for, not necessarily to have universal agreement. And thinking about this idea of culture, because there is a predictive element associated with it that might assist you in terms of presenting your speech. So you might be able to determine something about a group's behaviors or their attitudes or their values ahead of time. And we oftentimes talk about cultural groups in very large categories. They're known as demographics. These are observable characteristics of individuals. For instance, groups based on age or gender or ethnic background or education or political affiliation or religion. But they could be much more specialized. They could be based on a hobby or an interest or a geographic location. And in fact, for our purposes, college students are a culture, and community college students are a culture too, and Greenfield Community College students are a culture too. And I've had many students at GCC tell me that they've gone to other community colleges, and GCC is different. And it's not that it's better or it's worse, it's just different. In other words, there are different behaviors and values and attitudes. And I'll never forget when I first started at GCC, when I learned that for meetings, they generally started anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes late. That was sort of the cultural norm, and I needed to adapt to that norm rather than to have the whole college adapt to my preference. Over time, that's changed a little bit, so I'm happy to say that meetings start a little bit more on time, or at least closer to on time. And I'll also think about something like time that seems to be rather fixed, where that too can be very fluid based on one's cultural expectations and beliefs. And I think about a former colleague of mine, Dovia Fessi, from Africa, who talked about, of all things, bus schedules and how different the United States was in terms of its bus schedule as opposed to his homeland of Africa. That in the United States, the bus leaves at a specific time, 2:38, let's say. It doesn't matter if the bus is empty or full, but that's the time it must leave because it needs to be at its next stop at a particular time, and so forth and so on. And everyone's plans are dependent on that. And that makes perfect sense to us as Americans. And he discussed how in Africa that made absolutely no sense, that the bus should leave when it was full. And there was no reason for an empty bus to leave, whether or not there was a specified time that it was supposed to be leaving. The time it should leave is when it's full. And of course, the American objection to that would be, well, then it's going to be late. And the response would be, well, you get there when you get there. There is no late. Things begin when everybody is present. So it's a completely different way of viewing the world. In that sort of assumption, class starts when everyone is present and ends when everyone is done, whether it be 5 minutes or 5 hours. Again, it's a very different way of viewing the world, not necessarily better or worse, but definitely influenced by cultural beliefs and values and expectations and attitudes. So, in thinking about your audience, chances are you've got audience members that belong to dozens, if not hundreds, or even thousands of different cultural groups. So, you can't necessarily appeal to all of them, but definitely you can do some predictive behavior. Chances are, if you're speaking to a group of college students, my suspicion is that they would probably be pro-education. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case with every individual person. That's the problem with stereotypes, when you overgeneralize and assume that everyone in the group has to be the same. But there is a certain level of truth to it, so that could help you in terms of the way that you present your material, knowing some more about your culture. We talk about the United States being multicultural, in that the United States has many, many different cultures, multi being more than one. And then in terms of thinking about your audience, there's a section in chapter 5 that talks about what to do if you're going to have a hostile audience. I usually talk about that's something that's very rare for the average individual to encounter. Usually that's something that you might find, let's say, in a business or a political situation where you're well aware that you're going into that situation. So you need to have a thick skin, so to speak. So I doubt you'd ever be in a hostile situation, but you might be in a situation where your audience is skeptical and not necessarily as supportive as they could be or you would like them to be to your position. And I don't have a magic bullet for you, but some of the suggestions that were given in the text that I can also suggest to you. First, to establish some goodwill and the fact that you all want what's best. Areas of agreement. If you can find at least some commonalities, then there's less likelihood that everything will be objected to. Using credible outside sources, and that's one of the reasons why you'll be using outside sources for your third speech, the persuasive speech. Being professional, well prepared, so that you can earn your audience's respect. Using humor. Again, that can diffuse situations if, again, your humor is culturally sensitive. And you're being multi-sided. And sometimes just what individuals want is acknowledgement that there are other positions. They don't necessarily even need acknowledgement that their position is correct. They just want acknowledgement that there are other ways of viewing the issue. So as I indicated, I wanted you to watch that very brief video with Michael Bay so you could see his teleprompter fail. And then, and you'll see this at the very ending of our notes, I have 3 sample student speeches for you to watch. All of them were posted on YouTube. The first speech I deliberately chose because it is occurring in a military setting. So I thought that that would work very well in terms of what we were just discussing about culture. And that obviously that speech will be different because the expectations are different in the cultural group of the military. So you can see that they're standing in that uniform in a way that you wouldn't see with a civilian audience. The second and the third speech also are going to illustrate elements that in one way or another I've talked about in class. But what I'm most curious about are your interpretations and your feelings about the speeches. So for your attendance question, what I'm going to ask is for you to list one strength and one weakness for each of the 3 sample autobiographical speeches that I'm asking you to watch. And again, read your classmates' responses and my responses to all of you so that you can get a good overview. And when you actually upload your speech on Monday, that's what I'm going to ask individuals to do after all the speeches are uploaded, is to watch their classmates' speeches and to send the strength and weakness to me, and then I'll compile all of that and make that available. So I'm hopeful that watching these sample speeches will be of use to you. What we will do next class is have a quiz. As I indicated, it's 20 questions, mostly short answer, but some multiple choice and true false. And it'll be based on textbook information and what I've discussed in the videos. You'll have 24 hours in which to take that quiz and submit it in to me. And I'm also hopeful that we can set aside some time for some practice so that we can deliver one way or another, whether it be via Zoom or via upload on Monday. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class will be our quiz. Take care. Bye-bye.